Hi, I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia.
And I'm Alexis Hutrong in Gatineau, Ottawa, Canada. And welcome back to Uncommon Sense from the Sociological Review Foundation. Each month, we take a theme that we've spotted out there in everyday use, way beyond academia. This series, we've looked at things like, say, burnout, coffee culture, and making, and we bring in an expert guest to help us see that notion differently, more critically, and ultimately more sociologically, with our firm conviction that you don't have to be a sociologist to think like one.
The title of our show today is Life Admin, and we're giving it a double meaning. It's a term that's crept into the mainstream to refer to the endless and overwhelming paperwork that surrounds contemporary life. I guess it's very much a first world problem, arguably possibly a millennial one as well. But today we're actually going to be talking to someone whose work and knowledge gives that term a new meaning and a new gravity, because we're talking about the hard, crucial, and altogether more serious paperwork of documenting human rights abuses. It's a conversation that might lead us to questions like, how does everyday experience get turned into actual knowledge? How does concern over the future use of data shape how we create it right now, in the present? And why do we underestimate the nature and power of archives at our peril?
And to guide us today, our guest is Oriana Bernasconi, a sociologist based at the Universidad Alberto Hurtado in Chile. And she's interested in how massive episodes of political violence are resisted through the documentation of atrocities, and how societies confront those episodes and their legacies.
Oriana, welcome to Uncommon Sense.
Hey.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, I want to know, are you good at dealing with paperwork and life admin in your everyday life?
Yeah, not very much. I don't, yeah, probably as many people, I don't take, it's not part of my main concerns to do paperwork, but I do keep some things from my family, from my children, such as photographs or drawers that they do, drawings when they were kids. Yeah, I think that goes back to my mother's way of archiving some things from the three of us in my family of origin. So yeah, I do some paperwork, but very selectively.
So Oriana, can you tell us, how did the things that we described in our intro, so human rights, archives, practices of documentation, how did they become your area of research? Was there a particular experience that kind of led you there?
Yeah, there was one. I was working in another topic, but I had certain training many years ago from my PhD actually, on narrative research and life stories. One of the memory sites that was recovered was a clandestine detention, torture, and place of execution of people during the dictatorship in Chile. Was recovered and turned into a place of memory. And in Latin America, these places usually have a archive of testimonies of those that survived these places with their life stories. So this place is called Villa Grimaldi. It's the first center, memory site recovered in Latin America from this era of dictatorships. And they asked me to listen to testimonies and sort of give them some feedback on the way they were, recording these testimonies. And so we had this meeting and we spent a day together with the team, the interviewer, the psychologist, the whole team. In order to comment on their work, they sent me, these were audiovisual records of these testimonies. So they gave me samples of them and also the forms they use with the interview guide and the informed consent. So all that is, the documents, the paperwork that is behind the actual interviews, our method in social sciences. And when I compare the interview guide with the actual testimony, I noticed how in the way we conduct interviews, we can try to shape the story. And that's the way I started to build up this idea of technologies of memory out of, all the artifacts and the objects we use to collect information in general, but, in this case in particular.
Oriana, much of your work centers around the case study of Chile. And before we go any further, could you just, give us a little bit of extra detail here? What happened in the country in the 1970s and onwards? Who was Pinochet? The context for sort of the mass atrocities and violations that we're going to refer to today?
Yes, of course. Well, this is the context of the Cold War. So inspired by what they call the national security doctrine, Latin American armed forces led a number of dictatorships and what they call dirty wars to confront this menace of communism to spread across the continent. We had a number of dictatorships from Guatemala to Chile, and a number of people were tortured, executed, forcibly disappeared during this period in Latin America. In the case of Chile, on September 11, 1973, the armed forces, led by General Augusto Pinochet, the commander-in-chief of the army, backed by the CIA of the US government, seized power in Chile through a coup d'etat, which deposed the government of the first socialist president democratically elected in the world, ending this revolutionary project underway in this Latin American society. And this dictatorship lasted for 17 long years. It was ended by democratic means through plebiscite. So he had to call to a plebiscite, he lost the plebiscite, and he had to call to elections, and therefore we recovered democracy in March 1990 when I was a teenager.
And in terms of the sort of the atrocities that we're going to be talking about, did people at the time know that this was going on, or was the government hiding it?
Well, usually when the state is the perpetrator, they don't leave any paper trail, accounting for atrocities. They use all the means they have to erase any trail of these crimes. But what is particular of Chile, that's why we took this case, is that a number of human rights organizations emerged just before the coup d'etat. The first of these organizations started to provide assistance to those repressed 20 days after the coup d'etat. So a very, rapid response. And therefore, in Chile, unlike other countries, we have documentation of mass atrocities with information from the very time they were happening. And usually what do you do? A society ends a period of, civil war or dictatorship. Then you start trying to unfold information to produce the truth of that tragedy. But that's usually something that happens, as part of the transition to democracy, peace, as part of peace building, kind of practice.
And would we be right in saying that this particular case was foundational for human rights reporting and the creation of human rights archives at a more global level in other states around the world?
Yes, because what these organizations, it was a system of organizations in Chile, also in Argentina, there were some. They provide assistance to the repressed, legal assistance, so sort of reinstallating the right to legal defense, even in a dictatorship. That's very, courageous thing to do. They would provide psychological and social assistance. You have to bear in mind that sometimes there was a family and both parents were taken, by the armed forces. Those children were left by themselves. And so actually there was one organization that was in charge of particularly of children and very traumatized children. It was a pacific form of resistance, but it was a form of resistance, very active. So they would assist victims, but they would do this work very publicly. They would also denounce human rights abuses. They would produce reports every month, every year, stating what they were finding, through these individual testimonies. So they did a lot of what we call sociological work in terms of, transforming a testimony into information, classifying kind of repressive acts, and keep information about their behavior throughout the years. They would use the structure of the Chilean church, of the Catholic Church, to spread this information throughout the country and also to international agencies who would then, help in the enunciation and, spread this information around the world. It was a very clever, in terms of, if you want, sociology of organization, it was a very clever, way of organizing things, both to make these organizations to last the whole dictatorship, and also to legitimate their work, both nationally, internationally, and to make everyone known about these crimes, disseminate the truth of the victims. It wasn't easy. The whole state, with the media spreading their own version of these enemies, there was a lot of montage in the media saying that they were killing themselves, that they were, traitors, and a lot of things, and therefore information, and very, very acute information, was very important to confront. That's why we say that what these organizations can do is to sort of make the reality of state violence visible for the whole society.
I mean, one brilliant and very moving example that you and your colleagues highlight of this kind of work, this that the organizations were doing, is a huge document that translates as the sheet. I think you describe it as a kind of analog Excel sheet, and it seems significant because it's about building a picture of abuses, not as random but as systematic. Can you tell us more about that document?
Yeah, in these human rights archives, you would find very different kind of artifacts, papers, obviously, as also photographs, ID cards showing that the existence of those disappeared, pieces of even fabric of the clothes the person was wearing that day, the day they were captured. And you will also find in the archive of the main of these organizations called Vicaría de la Solidaridad, Vicariate of Solidarity, these handmade spreadsheets that were piece of paper glued together, so very handcraft made, with a number of fields of information. The one we work more with has 42 fields of information about more than 100 people that were killed and disappeared in 1976. And this spreadsheet was organized by month and day of the month, showing this systematicity. So this wasn't, an individual case. This was a state policy of mass, violence against members of the Communist Party, in particular that year. It has 6 handwriting styles on it. So it's, and you can have an idea with that of the collective nature of this endeavor. It was done by the human rights organization with the help of the relatives of the disappeared, that would go to the clandestine political parties to get some pieces of information to try to fill gaps. And so you can have an idea of how, especially in the case of enforced disappearance, what we call detenidos desaparecidos, it was a crime. It wasn't a crime we knew, beforehand. So they were trying, these social workers, lawyers, sociologists at these organizations were trying to make sense of a crime we didn't know it existed. You can have a sense of they trying to fill gaps of information, to try with new data to ameliorate harm, to try to find people alive, to try to save lives.
You make that link between these artifacts as they become technologies, right? And I think you mentioned technologies of denunciation or technologies of memories. Is that correct?
Yeah, we call them technologies of memory in the sense that they help us to understand and to also commemorate. It's obviously they are technologies of information in the way they were used. this goal. It's just not information, it's information in order to intervene, it's knowledge for intervention and, as I said, to ameliorate damage. But also in the long run, in the long term, there are technologies of memory. We can go back to those days. We can have access to the testimonies, first-hand testimonies of those that lived these experiences.
And this kind of gives us insight in how we can start to see why a science and technology studies approach is valuable to the study of human rights. Yes? Like, can you explain to us what science and technology studies is?
Yeah, it's an interdisciplinary field of scholarship that is interested in the relationship of sciences, knowledge, technologies. It's a field very diverse, so you can use it in different areas. In our case of sociology, it's not very common in human rights and in politics, but we are, trying to make some progress in making these topics to relate to STS.
So you say it's not very common. So what would you say are some of the things that it brings to the study of human rights?
Well, for us, many things. I would say that I've been, conducting research in Chile, but also in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, about how we document atrocities. And in my case, I wouldn't have come to this idea of, these infrastructures and these artifacts and these devices without STS scholarship. My main focus of attention are documents and papers, artifacts, is not human beings, although they speak about human beings in very powerful ways. They tell us how horrible we can harm each other, but also how we can be, solidarity can be built up, can come forward to help those repressed. And also I'm concerned with questions about how things hang together and how they are sustained over time. How, these documents travel across time and space. That's a very STS question. In sociology, we're more used to think about, that's the way I was trained, at least, how, social issues are emerged and maybe how are they reproduced. But this question of how they are sustained, so the kind of effort you have to make to sustain something as a social formation, that's something that I'm bringing from STS. We, for example, build up new concepts. We work with the idea when we are following these objects from the archives in the 70s to a judicial trial in Buenos Aires in 2016, how this use, for example, a sworn declaration is used by the judge to convict somebody, to make justice. We speak about objects being transposed into other fields. We also have expanded some concepts, as I said, artifact, infrastructure. So we speak about technologies of memory, or in a new project we are starting now, infrastructure of knowledge. So they all come from STS. And also in terms of methods, what we did in these archives is an ethnography of archives. And we use the idea of infrastructural inversion from Volcker and Listard in sorting things out. So exploring all the materiality that is behind, that supports the job, these human rights defenders did. Yeah, so that's some things that we take from STS.
So these artifacts are kind of in the background sometimes, right? But from hearing you speak, we really get that sense that they speak to collective issues and collective possibilities also, possibly. And as you say, you've done work on archives. I mean, they're often seen maybe as a kind of like a dead space, like full of paper rather than people, and kind of the end result maybe of something instead of the start of something new. But we really get the sense that you see archives differently. Could you tell us a bit more about how you approach and define archives?
Yeah, I think of archives as social organisms, so quite alive. Of course, there are traces of human action in the sense I just have been speaking of. In the case of human rights archives, they are those that document systematic state-led abuses of power through violence. But they also tell about resistance to harm. So how people get organized, the actions of denunciation, the claims of justice, the search for the missing, the call for international pressure on the repressive government. It's important to bear in mind that human rights archives are not only about atrocity, they are also about how we, come forward as, human beings to try to put an end to these repressive periods. And that's something we as sociologists need to bring, because it's part of, social learning and, capacities that we have to build up in our societies, in our communities. And in that sense, we also have the book. It's about a third actor. Is the one that assists the victims and register these events. And usually when you think about violence and political violence, you would have two actors, the perpetrator and the victim. But here, if you think about these issues from the point of view of the archive, of the Human Rights Archive, a third actor will come to the scene, which is that mediates this relationship, that made it public, that documents this human harm, human violation. So, yeah, and I think these archives are very a compelling antidote to oblivion, to revisionism, to ignorance. So when you don't have these archives, impunity would prevail. And that's very complicated when you have to recover a society from these episodes. It's very difficult to keep peace, to strengthen democracy, if what prevails is ignorance and impunity. And I think in the big picture, in a more, if you want, anthropological sense, these archives teach us about cognitive, political, affective actions, the humanization, but also of confronting those forces. I found them very sociological objects and social productions or products. And I'm interested both in the product, what is in the archive, what they are, and the functions, which functions do they serve throughout the years, the decades, in the case of Chile, 50 years from the coup d'etat, but also as a practice. You can, and that's where it gets more sociological. So which knowledge are gathered in this archive, what they can do, what kind of actions follow. And also something that we have added, and is not very much in the hegemonic literature, is how you can also trace kinship lineages in the archive. So a lot of affective dimension, how bonds are forged through the recognition of common pain, how people got together to search for the missing, the loved ones. And so how a number of communities, we have in the whole Latin America, the organizations of the relatives of the victims of those days and of these days. And the documentation and the archives are very important, because they tell you and you are searching for the same kind of victim. So go together.
Some of these questions that you ask about the archives, that they're a product, but they're also a practice, and what are the knowledges that are contained within it, and all of these, it's really making me think about some decolonizing archival work I've come across recently in Australia. And I saw this amazing film by the artist Jazz Money Winangana, which I think we'll probably add to our show notes. And she used footage collected by the Australian National Film and Sound Archive, a lot of which was really racist on sort of Indigenous Australians, over dating a long way back in Australian history. And she created this amazing film about Indigenous Australia and history and resistance and resilience, using this archival footage sort of patched into this incredible patchwork. And it both drew attention to so many of the assumptions and values that underpin the creation of the archive and what was sort of chosen to be selected in the first place and all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, was able to tell this incredible new story as well. And it's just, it was just a really fascinating, amazing film. And it kind of makes me feel like some of what you're talking about here, it's almost like the archive is a kind of intellectual archaeological site in a way. And I'm curious about, you've spoken about quite a few different disciplinary areas already, but, speaking a bit more about your disciplinary inspirations, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, maybe.
Yeah, probably more about from sociology and social theory. To think about archives in these terms, I have used pragmatic philosophy because I'm interested in the effects, how archives are used or the documents. So instead of the question of what language is or documents are, I'm more concerned with the question of what these documents or this knowledge that is built in these archives are used and with which effects, which realities they help to produce. So that's in the branch of pragmatic theory. And then also there are a number of works that I use a lot, such as Jacques Derrida, who has, this idea of the forces that rule an archive. And he plays with this idea of two forces. One is the creative force, that institute, that creates, that, label, that join things together, that enunciates. And the other is the force that excludes, that organizes. And this is a very, very useful way of thinking about archives, because as we have been saying, you in the archive, you have a parcel of reality. You don't have everything there, especially if you are talking about this very difficult kind of knowledge. And also I have used a lot of Michel Foucault. I work with genealogists, so this idea of moving around time to see how, if you go today to the Memory Museum in Chile, you would have the Truth Commission reports at the beginning of the tour. And this Truth Commission, I know because of the research I've done, that the cases that are there belong to, or where, they started to be recorded in the 70s in these human rights organizations. So I do this genealogical work, and Foucault is very key in thinking of knowledge and the relationship between knowledge and power, and how you can, confront power through knowledge. I think also, and that's something that you can bring into sociology and sociological thinking, how in the way these human rights violations were inscribed over time, a certain enunciative regime was forged, the way we enunciate human rights atrocities. So a whole grammar, if you want, was built and is still being used nowadays, pretty much in the way it was set up in those years. And I also work with some philosophers, women. I'm a feminist scholar, so I'm also very much concerned of bringing, women's scholarship. So first, Hannah Arendt, and this idea of the space of appearance is very powerful to me, because you can also think that what this documentation of atrocity does is to bring this reality into social view, give a space to this harm. I think that's a very, very sociological question. What's the space we as societies, in which space do we reserve to the harm we produce? That's a question that Hannah Arendt does.
I mean, you have already mentioned actually this idea of kinship, being able to find kinship ties in the archive. And am I right that you see archives as being able to connect the living and the dead together as well? So both kind of people to one another, but also, I guess, across history as well?
Yes, you're right. And they do it in a number of ways. During the repressive regime, It was a way of connecting the relatives, those that were searching for their loved ones, with each other, but also with this hope of what Derrida says, this deferral, this hope that they would find them at the end, at some point. So it's this kind of, things that these mass atrocities do to our notions of time and temporality. And also they connect the living and the death in the long term. For example, because we have these archives, they are nowadays places of memory. So new generations can connect with this story firsthand, going to these archives. So they can exercise what is called the intergenerational right to historical truth. We know a number of cases of, for example, grandchildren whose relative story has not been shared within the family, and they go to the archive to try to find it because they know that there is something that they want to know. And even what we have in Latin America is a movement of disobedience. These are relatives of the perpetrators, the son and the niece, that don't want to be part of that story, of that kinship, of that lineage. And they decide to join their human rights cause. Even sometimes they change their names as well. So they go to this archive to learn how their relatives did to other human beings. They, in that sense, they help to restore wounded communities, and they help in commemoration. In the Chilean case, and I would say in general, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Peru, in Colombia, in Mexico, these archives are being used to memory exercises and practices in schools, to nowadays to teach children about citizenship, about the importance of democracy, also about state violence, but not just about that, how to prevent. So they help in what we try to guarantee the non-repetition of these atrocities. So in that way, they can connect. If they keep being, stored in a good way, you can, make a lot of these archives over the years.
You've already introduced us to this idea of technologies of memory, which I believe you've developed with your colleagues, Elizabeth Lira and Marcela Ruiz. Could you expand a bit on that, and maybe particularly about the related idea of inscription? So my sense, and something you've mentioned, is that there's something to be said about turning a moment or an experience into knowledge, and that knowledge then being able to travel beyond the original context. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's this idea that all this materiality, papers, typewriters, or forms that we use to collect information, this spreadsheet that we speak about, they help to make human rights violations conceivable, legible, visible. All this practice of naming them, give them a name. We didn't have a name for enforced disappearance before this crime was committed in Latin America. So all that knowledge comes from these very micro practices of naming, organizing, classifying, compiling, keeping record of, using, disseminating. Because in the field of memory studies, which were sort of part of my work goes to, there is a prevalence of testimonies as a way of speaking about atrocities. So this idea of, but testimonies need these technologies, in the sense of, this whole materiality, even the archive, or, that you need to archive information in order to retrieve it in a later moment. So, let's pay attention to all this infrastructure that supports human rights work.
I mean, one of the things we've sort of not talked about a lot yet is the fact that these technologies, or the artifacts, they could also, I suppose, be forces for harm in the sense that, to make a record or to document something or to, register something is also an act of omission or an act of exclusion in and of itself, right? There are things that are not, there are decisions being made about what to capture, what not to capture. And similarly, the technologies themselves could also be used to sort of commit atrocities and abuses. So like, I'm thinking here of something like census data on ethnic identity being used to later discriminate against people, or maybe, like just about how practices of documentation and data gathering and even, just the concept of technologies more broadly could get a bad name. It could contribute to genocide or, even something as simple as a data breach. And I'm curious about how you think about that as a sociologist working on the use of data gathering in a positive context, whether you give much thought to, how these acts of gathering data might also have negative consequences.
Yes, of course, that's a very good point. We have gas chambers. We use technology to poison people, to produce bombs. So, but to put that technology to very, very harmful uses. And also in terms of archives, we have to bear in mind that we also, as societies, we also have what we call archives of atrocities or archive of evil, or there are a number of names. So these are the archives of the perpetrators. Sometimes, like in Argentina, for example, they have recovered the archive of the police, also in Guatemala. And you can put the archive of the perpetrators to a human right use if you recover it, to try to make sense of what happened, to gather information, to bring the perpetrators to justice. So you can produce a number of human rights practices or actions through the archive of the perpetrator. So that's why the pragmatics of it is important, because in either way you can use it for good or bad reasons. It depends on the function and the use you make of them.
Oriana, we're going to be back in just a moment to talk about a thinker or some thinkers who've inspired you. But first, a word from Mikola.
Hi there, this is Mikola Benson, the Chief Executive of the Sociological Review Foundation. Thanks for joining us to hear from Oriana Bernasconi from Alberto Hurtado University, Chile, talk about her work on archives and state violence, shedding new light on life admin. We're really enjoying putting season 3 together so far and have covered subjects from coffee culture to burnout, joined in conversation by scholars from around the world. We've been working really hard to make sure that the podcast is a valuable resource. If you've been to the sociologicalreview.org, perhaps to check out our show notes or our other podcasts, you might have clocked that the Sociological Review Foundation is a charity. We're a charity that's committed to advancing public understandings of sociology, something that we believe is needed now more than ever. And so we want to ask you a favour. If you're able to, please consider making a contribution to help us keep bringing this podcast to you. Just head over to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense and you can follow all the directions to make a one-off or repeat donation, which will go to directly supporting the making of Uncommon Sense. And in case you didn't catch that URL, if you scroll down in our show notes, you'll find a link to take you directly there. Thanks to everybody who's contributed so far, and to those who are considering doing it in the future. It really does make a difference to what we're able to do. And of course, we're also grateful to all of you who are listening in. If you've got any comments, suggestions or feedback, please drop us a line at uncommonsense@thesociologicalreview.org.
Okay, Oriana, here's where we want to turn to hear about a thinker that gave or maybe gives you still some uncommon sense. It doesn't have to be a sociologist. It could be a person whose whole life's work has inspired you, or maybe the author of a particular book that made you think differently as a student or an early career researcher. You tell us. Who are they?
Well, a number of authors. I've been in this field for 10 years, so I've been collecting good friends to think along. Pragmatic theory, to think about how words or speech acts, but also written words can have a role, are used in social action and with which effects. Also, a number of authors with which I've been thinking about archive in this more, as we said, sociological or anthropological way. Michel Foucault, as well, as I mentioned, in terms of thinking about, as sociologists, you're usually trained to think about contemporary issues and contemporary society, not too much about, although there is historical sociology, but not too much in terms of, going back on some years, some decades. And I've been using this genealogical method to think about the actuality, how our actuality has built up. So I feel I'm very much a sociologist, even though I've been working with the main, tragedy of my society, which is, date back to the 70s, so 50 years ago. But still, I think that it can tell us a lot about who we are nowadays. Also, I work with Judith Butler because I'm interested in the performativity of documents, but also of archives. She helped me to think about discursive and non-discursive practices and how they help certain phenomena to appear. She works with the idea of gender to be, a social construction. And you can think about patriarchal system as a social construction as well. And I try to think about these different political violence as a social fact and how it is built, and also, how we resist this kind of practices. And in that sense, for example, from Butler, it's important in terms of performativity to think about. I use it, for example, to think about of the subject of political violence, how the disappeared detainee has been performed over time. So I do a sociology of the subject without the subject because has disappeared. So I follow the different devices that have helped us to sustain this figure over time. The forensic device, the human rights device, the justice device, the affective device of the family that remembers them. And so Judith Butler is very important in that sense because it helps you to think about performativity as a collective endeavor and not as a singular or individual production.
We've touched on this idea of performativity in a prior episode with Karim Kubchandani on performance. But could you remind us what performativity is?
Yeah, I use the idea of bringing something into existence, and what is key here, what is something that Butler takes from the pragmatics of language, is the idea that, for example, gender is a construction, and there is a lot of social activity behind that construction. There is this idea of iteration, so you have to repeat gender norms in order for them to be sustained in society. So gender is something that is performed daily, it's very ordinary and every day in the way we speak, in the way we select things, and way we exclude, in the way we use our bodies. So in very mundane and repetitive and ordinary practices and representations, we perform, we bring into life, we do it again and again and again in certain ways. That's the normativity of it.
And it connects also to these elements that you've mentioned about power, for example, with Foucault and the archives and so on, as maybe mundane tasks associated with inscription and so on, kind of have powerful consequences subsequently.
Yeah, and for us, it's very important also in Derrida, this idea of iteration. So it's the power of this human rights organization relies to a certain extent in these violations be recorded once and again, and keeping track of them. So it's just not just, recall the testimony you gave because of the disappearance of your father, let's say, but also all the actions that you've made during the years to try to search for him. And even if, for example, somebody was released from prison from any of the clandestine detention centers that they had and went to the Vicaria, to one of these organizations of human rights, to give testimony as a witnesses, not just as a victim, but a witnesses of what he saw. And he would say, I was in jail with this, and this person. This piece of information goes to your folder, for the folder of the folder of your father. And so you would be, putting things together, it's a kind of puzzle, bringing pieces of the story together and trying to glue them together to make sense of, to try to reproduce the trajectory of those that were detained. And so this repetitive, this iterativity is very important to sustain this practice and to bring new information and to collect and put them together. And also we say that the livelihood of human rights archives relies in its citationality, so that they are used, that people use them as a source of information, they are kept alive if they appear in a textbook for children in the school, or if they appear in a documentary or in a novel.
Rosie had mentioned the aspects of omissions and exclusions, right? But by using these authors like Austin, Judith Butler, Derrida, you're really bringing to light some of the things that are, well, the actions, but also the people that exist right next to the archives, right? So it really sheds, it brings us to see in a not so common sense, right, the archives and what we'd assume them to be.
Oriana, thank you for talking us through the concept of performativity and introducing us to the works of Derrida and Butler. We'll be putting links to those works in our show notes. But before we go, we wanted to grab one other thing to add to our show notes, if that's okay. And that's your recommendation of something that speaks to our theme today, which is paperwork, a pop cultural item, or at least a non-academic item, let's say.
Yeah, there are many, as I said, novels that use actually our archival work to tell the story, different stories about the atrocities, but also how we make sense of them. And there's a very nice book about parenthood that is written by the son of the disappeared. And is very nice because he tells this whole story of the disappearance and the search and justice. But also, for me, it's actually a book about parenthood because it tells how he managed to build bond with a father that he lost when he was 4 years old. Also, I would recommend a audiovisual production that is called Una historia necesaria, a needed story, I guess. It's comprised of 16 episodes, of 5 minutes episodes that narrate real stories about victims of forced disappearance, mainly of the Chilean dictatorship. What I like of it is that it is based, obviously, in the archives, but also in Truth Commission reports, judicial research. So how the archive is being filled up with other archives of other, social entities, such as the judicial. In a very short time, they tell the story of one of these victims, but in a very effective way. So they connect you very effectively with the experience of losing somebody through state violence. So I think it's very well done, and it uses the audiovisual resources very, very effectively in that sense.
In connection to that, it makes me think about, in terms of popular culture, right? A piece that was produced by Patrick Keating. That's a theatrical piece, basically, that's been digitalized. That's called Inside Out, where he tells his story of being inside the Canadian carceral system. And in that piece, he kind of always refers to his file as a prisoner, right? So guards telling him, I'll put it in your file. Social workers saying, I'll put it in your file. And never being able to see that file and knowing what is there, that's basically telling his life story, right? But from the view of others. So that's something that I might recommend in terms of, archives, important archives in connection to people that are victims. Thank you very much, Oriana. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll be sure to put the different readings and thinkers who Oriana mentioned into our show notes, plus more about the history of Chile. Those show notes can all be found in the app you're using to hear this and on the podcast page at thesociologicalreview.org. There, as ever, you can also browse our themed magazine, enjoy our other podcasts, and take a look at the Sociological Review Journal, and much more.
Our sound engineer was Dave Crackles, and our producers were Emma Holton and Alice Block. We'll be back soon with more on common sense. Thanks for listening. Bye.